Hello. Bill Carroll of Zenny 62 Sports Media, and as any serious or even not so serious football fan has now heard, Calvin Ridley, the wide receiver and budding star wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons, has been suspended for the entirety of the 2022 season, and possible it could go on longer, but certainly for the whole season. Which means two things: not only will the Falcons be without him, but also it means that they will. I guess the one sort of silver-ish lining is cap relief because his $11.16 million salary for that season is off the books. And they can most likely, we'll see what happens. They might be able to essentially request that he they be let out of the rest of his contract. I'm assuming, and I haven't seen his contract, there's probably something in there that covers things like that. Things that are detrimental to the game, detrimental to the team, which means they can probably also get out of the last year of that contract. And in 2024, he would normally become an unrestricted free agent anyway. So obviously this means that for teams that are trying to get Calvin Ridley, and there was a robust trade market out there for him, will have to wait. And he may then become available as an unrestricted free agent. If the Falcons do decide to retain his rights, then a year hence, they may still try to move him. Other things that will change, of course, will be the possible draft implications. There probably would have been a young receiver drafted, or maybe even more than one young receiver drafted, even if they kept Calvin Ridley this year. But they will most certainly be a team that is targeting, there's people like Khalil Shakur or Christian Watson. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody like Sky Moore from Western Michigan was a player that they might consider. So a lot of things are in play here. So the legal implications have largely played out. I'm assuming there may be some sort of challenge, but I'm guessing that if you get to this point, they've probably already exhausted a lot of their other legal recourse. So the problem is, from this point going forward, is one, when will he be reinstated? It won't be until after the season is over. And will the Falcons, like I said, seek to retain his rights? My guess is no. They are a team that's probably headed towards a rebuild anyway, and being able to get one of the bigger contracts off the books, even though not under the circumstances you would like to, probably is something that somewhat appeals to them. And last but not least, for this young man who was essentially moving into the peak of his career, what should have been his not only peak earning years, but should have been the peak of his production. He's going to lose that. We've seen it happen other times. Players at their peak removed. Usually it's injury, but we've seen. Obviously a guy like Jim Brown left, even though it's towards the end of it. Well, it ended up being the end of his career, but he still obviously had another couple of years left. We've talked about obviously the semi-curse of Detroit with guys like Calvin Johnson and Barry Sanders leaving once again still towards the end of their careers, and they weren't at their peak, but they still had probably one or two more constructive and productive years left. Many people, if they're old enough, and I am old enough, will remember when Ed Too Tall Jones spent a year boxing. And I think to some extent, some of the things he learned in terms of conditioning and hand usage made him an even more effective player when he returned. But he lost, one of the peak seasons of his career. He still ended up with about 107 career sacks. Those sacks were unofficial. He's a guy who probably should get more consideration for the Hall of Fame, but that's another video. So what does this mean if you're a Falcons fan? Well, one, your team has lost, as I said, one of the more prominent, more expensive, but one of the more prominent players on your team, and a player who was going to be, if you retained him, one of the linchpins that you built around an offense. But the cap relief does mean that if this team decides after, whatever else happens in free agency, whatever happens in the draft, that they do want to look to, as they rebuild, spend some of that money that they are getting back on a free agent, it gives them a little more flexibility because they were a team that was seeking to some extent some cap relief going forward. And then last but not least, like I said, the human toll. Calvin Ridley came in as Robin, if you will, right? The second receiver, and got to watch what Julio Jones went through day after day, seeing what it took to be a number one, a primary receiver, the top receiver on a team, and worked to himself to the point where he was becoming, maybe not Julio, because that's not something you can really become unless you're Julio Jones, but he was becoming or moving towards becoming a consistent number one receiver, though it would have helped him to have more help, and I think they would have done that in the draft. And now he is going to be either, like I said, a person who misses this year and then comes back to the Falcons, or I think more likely becomes an unrestricted free agent sooner rather than later. So, one, let me know what you think. Where do you think Calvin Ridley lands? Where do you think he ends up when this is all said and done? Do you think the Falcons will try to find some way to bring him back once his suspension is over? And I guess equally as likely, if indeed they move on, if indeed they decide to seek to permanently end his contract as opposed to just losing him for this season, what do you think this does to their draft strategy and their free agency strategy? Do you think that this further compels them to add a receiver? So I'm looking forward to hearing your full feedback, seeing your feedback, and let me know what you think. And if there's something I missed or something that I didn't do, let me know.